With Lesson 15, we begin our final lesson. Before we start, I'd like to say, because this is the final lesson, that this class has given me the unique opportunity where, due to some personal experiences and technological difficulties and other things, I did not have all the lessons prepared before the semester began, which is typically the case. And so I've had the unique experience of finishing up these lessons after the semester started. And I want to say that so far I've really enjoyed our discussions on Blackboard and really enjoyed what you had to write in the first round of papers. And I think this class is filled with interesting ideas, and it's been really fun to read those ideas and discuss them back and forth with you and see you develop them into papers. And so we've had about as strong discussions as I think one can have in an online class, and I've really enjoyed those discussions, and it's been a very enriching experience for me. I hope it has been for you too. With Lesson 15, our final lesson, we're covering our last literary theme, which is innocence and experience. We've really talked about this all semester long, and I've just chose it as the title for Lesson 15, in part for lack of a better title, and in part because it is crucial to our theme of the power of fear for the course, and is something that has come up quite a bit. It goes back to William Blake, the very first author we read. In the poems we read of his, The Chimney Sweeper in London, were from his collections Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, respectively. And these two collections were often published together. He often published them that way when he put together his books of poetry during his life. So in many ways we've also come full circle here. As I mentioned, though, 2 lessons ago when we were looking at the post-9/11 issues in Marvel Comics, I wanted to focus on post-9/11 literature for these last 3 lessons, because as we move from into the 20th and 21st century, one of the 2 questions I'm asking you for this discussion board post for this final lesson is, what is the current state of literary studies? What books are popular right now? What direction do you think it's heading? And I feel like it's almost impossible to ignore to answer that question and ignore 9/11. We're going to talk about how major historical events influence literature in this lesson. We've talked about this some with cultural context already, but particular moments of crisis. And that's clearly the most recent, most significant one for writers today. Robert Gray's book, After the Fall, is a great book on the topic of post-9/11 literature, because he kind of focuses in on the central arguments of the field. A lot of novels and plays were written and movies made right after 9/11 about the events, and Gray kind of surveys the field and says, this is what I found. So it's a great book if you're interested in that field for kind of understanding it better. And so we look just at his introduction as the lens text for this final lesson. He says, after 9/11 happened, deep rhythms of cultural time had been interrupted. So this is again the same kind of argument as the other 2 authors made that we looked at in Lesson 13, that 9/11 caused normal narratives, normal projects of order, normal kind of cultural progress at the time to cease, to be interrupted, to be disturbed, to be destabilized and unsettled. So this is, in your papers I ask you to kind of summarize the state of the critical field, what critics are all commonly agreeing on. This seems to be the thing they're agreeing on with 9/11 literature, and Gray really summarizes that idea well, encapsulates it really well in this brief statement I have quoted here. He goes on to say that one could think of 9/11 as indicating that a rough beast of a new era is slouching to America. So one of the poems for today by Yeats, The Second Coming, has the famous line you probably heard before but may not have read before now, of a rough beast slouches toward Bethlehem. And so Gray is intentionally riffing on Yeats here. I included this quote obviously to show the connections between the different pieces we're reading. And we'll talk about this more on the next slide with Yeats, but Yeats is clearly talking about the transition to a new period of history and a new era, and that's what Gray is saying here about 9/11. All 3 of these authors have used these three critics, the two from Lesson 13 and now Gray, have used different terminology to describe and say basically the same thing, whether they're calling it a Cicera or this sentence here. They're all saying that 9/11 is such a significant and traumatic event that history and literature cannot be the same, are not the same after it. It's ushered in a new era, a new transition. And so Gray encapsulates that well here. He also says that events similar to 9/11 have happened before, though, and he cites a number of them. He calls them crises, and he says that crisis is typically viewed as descent from innocence to experience. So this idea of transitioning into a new period of history, a new era, is one way of saying we're transitioning from innocence to experience. Not that we weren't experienced before, but that comparatively that past epoch seems innocent now because of the trauma or the crisis we've experienced. So he cites other examples. He's saying this idea of crisis as descent from innocence to experience is an old narrative. It often happens after war. And the examples he gives are authors writing after, Mark Twain and Henry James writing after the Civil War, Hemingway and Fitzgerald writing after World War I, and then he goes through with other authors for World War II, Vietnam, etc. And so it's not a new narrative, but it's been rekindled by 9/11. There's sometimes a lull or a period where this type of focus in literature isn't at the forefront until an event like 9/11 comes along and rekindles it. So he says that 9/11 leads to a series of contradictions. Mourning and melancholy is one, which is an idea that comes from Freud, that once we've experienced tragedy or loss, we're supposed to mourn, and mourning is the psychologically healthy response, and melancholy, as it's binary, is the open wound, the wound that has not healed. Melancholy prevents us from healing. And so he says that part of why 9/11, the effects of it are so pervasive in literature and are lasting right now, 10 over almost 15 years later, is because the wound is open. And he cites things like the Patriot Act, which we talked about a lot in the last two lessons with the comics that have addressed the Patriot Act. Those kind of things are preventing us from properly mourning, and we're still in a state of melancholy. So even though, before I move on to the next point, I should say another contradiction I didn't have room for on here was magic versus kind of a desire to conquest or conquer nature. Magic is a way to return to nature, and then versus the conquest of it. And these are two kind of opposite responses to what we do in crisis, to either revert back to like kind of an earlier state with nature, or to try to conquer the natural world. So that's just yet another contradiction I meant to list as an example, but ran out of room. So what Gray goes on to say is that even though this crisis is descent from innocence to experience is an old narrative, common after war, the rekindling of it, followed by 9/11, has caused two things to happen that are different. Two new things have been added to this narrative with the advent of 9/11 rekindling it. The first is that the nature of the crisis of 9/11 is different, and the second is that the response by writers is different. So the nature of the crisis is different for three reasons, according to Gray. And they all start with an I. The first is invasion. America is under attack for the first time. We talked back in Lesson 13 about this because that writer, of the two writers there, the first one who talked about Avengers Disassembled, argued that 9/11 disrupted these narratives, and particularly narratives that put men in positions of power. And so America being attacked for the first time is one of the reasons 9/11 destabilizes that narrative. Because if we're shown to be vulnerable, the patriarchy, that's in charge is shown to be vulnerable. But Gray makes a good point here, because America is under attack. I mean, he cites things like Pearl Harbor, but he mentions that even then there was the idea that the war was mostly contained to the Pacific and the Atlantic and Europe, and that was more of an isolated incident, a traumatic one that triggered America's entrance into the war. But the idea wasn't out there necessarily culturally that Japan or Germany would continue to invade America after that incident. Whereas with 9/11, the war on terror, like the Patriot Act, the war on terror being another thing that keeps the wound open, keeps us in a melancholic rather than a mourning state. The war on terror clearly indicates there's the pervasive fear that this could happen again, and it has happened again. Not necessarily to America, but to the West in general. Remember, he's saying here, back to that quote about the rough beast, it's not just America that's threatened here, it's Western conceptions of ways of life. And so certainly the 7/7 attacks in the underground in London in 2005 are one example that, this is ongoing. Obviously, everything about ISIS right now, certainly not debatable that this is ongoing. I mean, it's a very rational kind of fear, but it nonetheless keeps us in a melancholy state, and nonetheless makes America different, makes 9/11 different from other crises other authors have written about in the past. He goes all the way back to the War of 1812, when Britain invaded the U.S. to try to reclaim it as the last time our borders were really threatened by an outside force. And of course that predates the Civil War, which was the earliest example he used for this type of crisis, sparking this kind of focus on innocence and experience in literature. After invasion, he has icons. So the two towers are more iconic than any other symbol to appear in literature following earlier examples of similar crises. He quotes one poet who said that before 9/11 he hated the two towers because it represented the two towers were kind of seen before 9/11 as this pinnacle of America's national achievement. Look at how great America is because these towers are so tall. And in many ways that could be said that that's why the terrorists chose those as targets. So they had this iconic significance before, and after it's even greater. I remember seeing a film called 25th Hour with Edward Norton I think it came out 2 or 3 years after 9/11. Long time ago I saw it, and it's not about 9/11 necessarily, but the characters live in New York, and clearly the after effects are present. And the opening scene while the credits are playing shows these two high beams, these two lights, flashing all over New York in different positions, and several times they take the form of the two towers where they used to be located. And so this clearly, is an allusion to 9/11, since the movie has to do with kind of what life is like after 9/11 in New York, and it clearly reflects Gray's view here that the two towers are very iconic. With other crises before, we hadn't had iconic symbols like this that writers would employ in a wide variety of ways. The final is the intervention of media. He calls 9/11 a global media event. Now, one thing you may know about the Vietnam War, which is obviously an earlier crisis, one of the earlier crises Gray cites when he's talking about the history of this concept, is that the Vietnam War was the first time where war was really broadcast on national television. And that was a big deal. But what's different here with 9/11 is it's not just on national television, it's on international television. It's a global media event. And television is experienced differently now because of the internet and social media. So, obviously social media wasn't around in 2001 the way it is now, but you still had global media that you didn't during Vietnam. So that gave the event of 9/11 an immediacy that wasn't there with other crises like it before. That people around the world who weren't in New York, who weren't even in America, were able to kind of experience this. Obviously the experience was different, but they were to see it happen simultaneously. And that makes it an entirely new level of crisis. It gives it an immediacy. Feeling it immediately, wanting immediate, results afterward kind of thing takes place. So those are three things that make the nature of the crisis different from other similar crises that happened before. Similarly, the second point here he makes is that the writer's response is different from before. How is it different? Writers feel silenced. He opens up the introduction by saying that most writers, famous authors and philosophers, reacted with not being able to know what to say. They just didn't know how to express themselves. The factors are interconnected here. These three other things make this such a unique tragedy that it brings people who are known for speaking, communication, and writing to a point of silence. And so that's a really unique response. And so what he then says toward the end of the introduction, that what he intends to address in the chapter is how this has been dealt with. What can we say, if anything, about 9/11? And in the first chapter, he says he addresses writers who have failed to answer that question, that they've written things, but they still don't really know what to say about 9/11. And then in the second, third, and fourth chapters, he says he addresses writers who have found something to say. And their response is hybridity. Remember, we talked about hybridity in lesson 12 when we were talking about the others. So he's saying kind of cross-cultural responses in literature are the ones that he's found to be the most insightful in reading all this post-9/11 literature to write his book. So kind of a coming together, right? The attacks themselves clearly illustrate, the tensions between America and other cultures or other parts of the world, and so the response to that, to the silence caused by that, would be more, to come together, hybridity. So it's an interesting take. And again, I'm not necessarily saying I want you to agree with everything he says, because that's not the point of this class, but I think it's really good background for understanding how the field of post-9/11 literature has developed. And it's, again, 9/11 such an important factor for literature going forward that to answer the question, what is the current state of literary studies, we need to have these factors in mind. So I'd like you to keep them in mind as you turn to the literary text now and choose to compare two of them for your Blackboard post. I chose two Yeats poems for some of the literary texts. Going back to Blake and the idea of innocence and experience, I didn't really have another Blake poem in mind that I thought would work well, but Yeats is very similar to Blake, a little over 100 years later, but they both were very mystical, spiritual poets who had their own kind of occult beliefs, but that's more of a side note. They also engage similar themes and similar ideas, and there's two Yeats poems in particular that I feel are very applicable to what we're talking about with post-9/11 literature here. The first is The Second Coming. This is probably Yeats's most famous poem. And I'd like to say something about modernism real quickly. Obviously, that's a weighty, baggy concept we don't have time to break down here, but I would like to mention it because what a lot of the modernist writers like Yeats were experiencing, I think, is similar to what writers are experiencing with 9/11, primarily because of World War I. And of all the events Gray lists in his introduction that are earlier crises, I think World War I is the closest to 9/11 because, in similarity, although those things Gray points out that are unique about 9/11 are certainly accurate, World War I had a lot of its own uniqueness at the time, and it was a similar kind of shattering of innocences as new technologies were introduced that made killing more effective and more quick. And also it was the first ever world war, so the kind of disconnections between different countries that are also made apparent by 9/11 and lead Gray to argue that the novels that address hybridity are the ones with the best response. Those were also kind of made apparent, that disconnect between other countries through World War I. So the modernists are important here because they were the writers responding to World War I, and they saw the world as fragmented or torn apart. Connections that were once there have been destabilized, and through their art they tried, and they didn't necessarily succeed, but it was about the trying. They tried to pull those pieces, those fragments together. You see this right away in The Second Coming with the gyre and the falconer. When he says the gyre spins wider and wider, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. He's talking about these cylindrical cone shapes, and I have an image on the next slide to illustrate that. but essentially you know what a gyre is shaped like, and if you picture a falcon flying, you might see a similar shape, but it's getting wider and wider. The falconer cannot hear the falcon cannot hear the falconer, so he can't return to the falconer. You know, the shape isn't working out there. So it goes on to say things like the center cannot hold, things fall apart, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. These are all very famous lines, such violent imagery. This poem, the second half, with talking about the second coming, really gets into some of Yeats's odd kind of mystical beliefs. But the first half is particularly famous because of this violent, vibrant imagery and famous lines that have really characterized the state of the world after World War I. And so that's why we're looking at it in this lesson. And a really interesting line at the end of the first section is, the best lack all conviction and the worst have passion and intensity, which seems to be a contradiction. You know, why would lacking conviction be a good thing? And so this is something you can address in your post if you want to. But I would say real quickly about it that certainly the idea present here is that events like World War I and 9/11 kind of shake up what we normally believe. Traditional roles are challenged or questioned or destabilized or reversed, and in this case, perhaps reversed is one interpretation of this line, although there are many more, so it's one line worth exploring further. Finally, you have the biblical imagery of the rough beast, and this is where the poem starts to get, more, I think, problematic for readers. They don't know how to interpret it, and certainly Yeats's kind of mystical beliefs come in. But I think the questions that arise with a crisis like World War I or 9/11 are still present here, because you have a ancient world versus modern world dynamic that appears. The rough beast is the sphinx that has been sleeping all these years and is kind of moving forward. And so it's this apocalyptic vision, but you have Yeats in the early 20th century, not just writing about the end of World War I, but all these things that have been different. The car has been invented, the automatic artillery, the machine guns essentially, and mustard gas have been invented that can kill people faster. And so the 21st century, or the 20th century, for Yeats, is this world of technology and progress, and you have this kind of ancient beast slumping toward it, perhaps meaning that new epoch is going to end. And so Yeats is clearly describing something here in the characterization of the rough beast, and he's clearly evoking Revelation, which is why I included the passages from Revelation in this week's reading, although we're not necessarily going to spend a slide on them. But I included the passages on Revelation both because Yeats evokes them and because they also depict the end of the world. And I think comparing depictions of the end of the world to these texts about 9/11 and about World War I will kind of help us understand how writers were grappling with these moments of crisis. So Yeats is intentionally drawing on this biblical imagery of the end of the world to give us an apocalyptic moment in the text. And when you have this kind of ancient beast coming toward the modern world, I think he's saying a new period of history has been ushered in or is going to be ushered in. So that idea, going back to Gray, about 9/11 representing a new era, and Gray intentionally evoking Yeats here, is you can say a lot about the rough beast, and it can be blasphemous, and it can be very strange. But I think one thing you can certainly say about it is that it represents a transition from one period of history to another. Because events like World War I and the advent of new technology and new things in the modern period have caused that shift, just as 9/11, a little less than 100 years later, also causes a shift. The second Yeats poem I asked you to look at is Sailing to Byzantium, which is a similar poem. It doesn't discuss the destruction of the world like the Second Coming, but it kind of takes that world, that is no country for old men in the opening line, and then the author chooses to leave that world. So I see these almost as companion poems. I don't know if Yeats intended them that way, but the Second Coming describes the current state of the world, and Sailing to Byzantium describes the antithesis to it as the writer leaves. So that first line, that is no country for old men, is describing perhaps the world maybe modern Ireland for Yeats, where he was from, or just the current state of the world when he was living, that's more thoroughly depicted in the Second Coming, and the writer chooses to leave that. The No Country for Old Men descriptor, though, is also used as the title of Cormac McCarthy's famous novel, No Country for Old Men, that was made into a very popular, award-winning film. And I think that film and that novel address similar issues, going on in the 21st century. And so for those reasons could also be seen as kind of a post-9/11 thing, although not as overtly so. If we had more time, I may have assigned that work for the class. But what's interesting here with choosing the title for the film in the novel is McCarthy sees some similarities between his world and Yeats's. And so why is it, No Country for Old Men? What does that mean? And I think what it essentially means is it's a world you can't grow old in, because there's too much death and destruction all around. You cannot achieve immortality, so to speak, because once the speaker leaves and sails towards Byzantium, he wants to discover immortality. And so he leaves this war-torn natural world for Byzantium, where the birds and whatnot die. Now, Byzantium is an important place. The choice is intentional and specific. It's now called Istanbul. At the time Yeats references the 6th century, it was called Constantinople, but before that it was called Byzantium. And when the speaker in the poem gets there, he talks about these golden sages who he wants to make him immortal. And these are actual gold statues that are actually there in Istanbul, but they first were made or appeared there in the 6th century AD, or the statues appeared there in the 6th century. It changed its name. The name was changed from Byzantium to Constantinople in the 4th century. But these statues and what that period for Constantinople or Byzantium represents is it was considered a center of learning and achievement with some of the best art at that time in the 6th century. And so it was like the ideal place for the artist to live. And so Yeats is this angsty, conflicted artist living in post, World War I, Ireland and England. The Second Coming was published in 1921 and sailing to Byzantium in 1928. He wants to kind of leave that world behind. So he's not actually sailing to Istanbul. He's sailing to kind of a fictional, idealized place. It's an imaginative journey in the idea of Byzantium or Constantinople in the 6th century represents that idea. It's maybe almost Yeats's version of heaven, so to speak. But what's interesting about when the poet gets there is the artificial is seen as superior to the natural. He evokes the word artificial right away and says that it can give him immortality, and has these sages make him into a golden bird. This is very odd, but an interesting idea, because normally we would think of the natural as superior to the artificial. Artificial has kind of a negative connotation to it. But Yeats doesn't see it that way. And so I'm not sure why he doesn't see it that way, but that's an idea really interesting to engage with. Perhaps it's like lack of conviction versus passion and intensity, where a standard notion is being flipped because the world has been turned upside down by the war. It could also be that the natural world is no longer dominant, that technology has overcome it. And so something else must be offered instead. But in his kind of crazy mystical religion, Yeats finds spiritual truth in this artificiality. And certainly I don't see it that way, or you don't, because no one really follows Yeats's beliefs. He was by himself. The point here isn't about the beliefs themselves, it's about the fact that he believes he finds spiritual truth there. So he is seeing something there. He is, through art, offering some kind of alternative to the chaos and the disruption of time caused by World War I and modernity. So even if you or I, that truth may not work for you or I, it did for him. So it is possible. And he, like I said, Yeats is kind of this odd writer with this mystical beliefs like Blake, but perhaps it takes a writer like that to kind of go outside the box and address these kind of issues when a crisis like this comes along. So some interesting ideas to chew on. I'd like you in your post to either compare Yates or the Bible verses to DeLillo, because DeLillo actually talks about 9/11. So like I said, I'm not going to go through all the different images from the Bible verses on here for the sake of time, but keep in mind that they're depicting, the end of the world essentially, and rather than focusing on all of Revelation, I just chose a couple short passages that deal with some of the more terrifying images, because I thought those would be the most useful for comparison if you want to write on the Bible verses rather than Yates. But with that said, let's shift our focus for the last couple minutes to DeLillo and look at the actual short story written about 9/11. As we do that, real briefly, I'll pause here for just a minute, and you can look at the drawing of the gyre from Yates's notes. He actually saw the gyre is two different periods of history that were overlapping. The cones were inside one of another as, the beast slouches towards Bethlehem and one period of history overtakes the other. Perhaps it's the ancient reclaiming the modern, perhaps it's something else. So if you're interested in this, you can do more research into Yates's beliefs if you want. But I think more so than his beliefs, what the gyre really represents is the chaos and the disruption to time, the disruption to history that is caused by an event like World War I or 9/11. The gyre is almost Yates's way of, it's almost Yates's term that is similar to Sisera or some of the other terms we've seen used to describe 9/11. So that's one way to think of it and see how it's important to our discussion. All right, DeLillo, there's a lot of interesting novels that have been published about 9/11, and DeLillo has a novel from 2007 called Falling Man, and Still Life is a short story that predates it. He basically expanded the short story into a full-length novel, and because we have just a short class, just 7 weeks, 8 weeks long, I went with the short story. So I want to talk about postmodernism for just a minute, like I did modernism. Obviously, that's an even baggier and weightier concept, but just as Yates is kind of one of the really significant authors ushering in modernism and characterizing it, DeLillo is often cited as one of the first kind of frontrunners of postmodernism in U.S. literature. It would be Beckett in British literature. And so comparing the two, one writing after World War I as a modernist and one writing after 9/11 as a postmodernist, I think makes for an interesting comparison. And if the world, the modern world, because of technology and these other advances, and certainly now social media playing a role the way, the telephone in the car did in the early 20th century, social media playing a role in the 21st century, you have this very fragmented world. It's no longer seen as a cohesive whole. So if the modernists were trying to pull those pieces together and get back to something cohesive, the postmodernists are a little more optimistic, and they've kind of embraced those pieces and play with them. So postmodernism features a lot of distortion of reality and kind of manipulating things, bringing random events or characters together kind of thing. And DeLillo uses that approach in Still Life because the story begins in media res. Keith, after being in one of the two towers as it's falling, walks into his old apartment where his wife and son still live. And so, in media res is Latin for in the middle of the story. There's not really a beginning and a middle and an end to this story, which is a very postmodern thing. It's just an ongoing story. It's like we're seeing a brief snippet of the lives of Keith and Leanne and Justin, the small family that the story focuses on. We're just seeing a few minutes or a few years of their life, and there's no real beginning or middle or end. So we're just kind of inserted in the middle. But even in the events that take place in the story, it's still not the beginning of this short little story. It's in the middle of it. And then we continuously jump around. We go forward and backward in time, and there's no continuity, there's no shift, there's no clear break where this event, this discussion between these characters seems to be ending and it's logical to move on. When the transitions happen is completely illogical, and what they go to next and when that's taking place is also completely illogical, which is a very postmodernist technique. So if you thought you were missing part of your story, like the PDF didn't work or something, that's not it. That's just DeLillo's style, and it's a very postmodern thing. His two most famous novels are White Noise from 1987 and Underworld from, I believe, 1996, and they're both seen as kind of pinnacles of postmodernism. White Noise is one of the kind of staple classic texts of postmodernism that's it's a short, like 300-page novel that kind of is a great example to look at quickly for understanding or seeing an example of postmodernism. Underworld is a long, lengthy novel that's his magnum opus. That's kind of like the ultimate postmodern novel. So the jumping around like that is part of his style. But what's interesting about that, I mean, we're going from very structured style from the very beginning of the class, from epic poems that have a clear-cut structure because they're epic poems, to all the way to the present, to postmodernism at the end of the class where structure is intentionally absent. But I think literary approaches and styles reflect the time in which the texts are written, and I think the postmodern style makes sense in a post 9/11 world because of all the things we've talked about already with post 9/11 literature. And the jumping around in the text certainly gives me a feeling as I read it that that might be how someone's life would feel after experiencing these events firsthand, the way Keith's character does in the story. And so I think it's an effective technique like that. It may cause you to stop and kind of have to reread and whatnot, but that feeling that happens when you do that, I think, effectively conveys the emotions and the ideas DeLillo's trying to convey. So obviously the title is important. There's the still life paintings that Leanne sees at one point in someone's house. And so still life is yet, we've got several terms. We've got Yeats's gyre, we've got the caesura, if I'm pronouncing that right, caesura, and then other terms used by that are more like phrases rather than terms. The interruption of time, the stopping of ongoing projects of order, and now DeLillo's still life, that are used by different authors and critics to describe 9/11, but they all say the same thing. Time, culture, all that continuity as it normally moves forward stops. Caesura means pause. The gyre, the shape held by the falcon cannot hold once you can no longer hear the falconer because of the disconnect. Obviously, still life, caesura, they both indicate a pause. And so it's not just the paintings that are still life in the text. They're frozen, so to speak, for Keith and his family. Time is kind of frozen. What's the effect of time being frozen for them once 9/11 happens? Well, in a way, it kind of brings back the family back together. Keith starts living there again. He stops having the affair, and it sounds like they're essentially getting back together at the end of the text. When Keith is, at one point when the text is describing Keith's thoughts before 9/11, it says he wants to fly out of self-awareness, which I think is just the most fascinating phrase. DeLillo has some really beautiful language in his works, and this story is no exception. I think that's such an interesting phrase. Why does he no longer want to be self-aware? What does this mean? And how does it change after 9/11? Those are some questions to pursue. For Justin, Keith's son, seeing is believing. He denies that the two towers fell. He says they got hurt, but they didn't fall. And his mom, Leanne, tells Keith it's because Justin didn't see them on TV. She wouldn't let him watch the events of 9/11, which, remember, going back to what Grace said in the Lens text, media was one of the different factors here. And I remember this distinctly. I was still in school at the time, and I got up and went to school and hadn't heard about it, and then I got there and TVs were on in every room showing the events, and everyone stopped and watched them. And, I mean, we didn't have classes at first because everyone was watching the events unfold. And so media played such a powerful role, and Leanne in the story wouldn't let Justin watch the events, which is significant, and that makes it almost not real for Justin, whereas before, in earlier examples, not everyone bore witness to World War I who still believed it happened, but for Justin, without seeing it, he's perhaps in denial because of the level of the atrocity, but certainly also part of it is he just plain didn't see it, I think, is part of it too. I think DeLillo's making an intentional comment here, not just on trauma, but also on media in the 21st century. Leanne, the mother, also has a really interesting line where she's rewatching. She continuously rewatches the events again and again on TV, which is another thing, too, if you were too young at the time to really remember. The events were replayed a lot. And at the end of the story, her and Keith watched them together. But one of the times she's watching them, DeLillo says the footage enter her body. It goes under her skin, and its fleeting spirit carries the lives, their histories, everybody's lives, out beyond the towers. So, this is beautiful language. I'm not sure exactly what DeLillo's saying, but I do think it could be something akin to what Gray was saying at the beginning of our lesson when we discussed Gray about hybridity, right? Maybe there's some kind of existence beyond us where their lives are carried, and perhaps that's some kind of hybrid liminal existence where people come together rather than being torn apart by conflict. I don't know, but it's one interpretation that I have to offer based on the language, and I'd like to see your interpretations too in the posts. I said a few minutes ago, the family is essentially reunited by the crisis. Does that mean their lives move forward? I don't know. Are their events still frozen? Perhaps, but in the freezing, they were a family coming apart, essentially. The divorce wasn't final. They were just separated, and Leanne's mother was saying she needed to divorce Keith, and Leanne was reluctant to do so, even though they were separated and he was living somewhere else. So all of that kind of family being torn apart once 9/11 happens is put on pause. Once the still life, the caesura of 9/11 takes place, the way their lives were progressing is frozen. Does that mean they progressed in a different way? They don't necessarily officially declare they're staying together. Leanne asks him and he doesn't really answer. But they become intimate again and he lives there again. So is the former progression towards divorce just constantly on pause when the story ends? Or has some kind of change happened? And what role does 9/11 play in that? And Leanne talks about seeing the building burning on TV with Keith next to her, knowing he was in it and he's there now. And that experience is so surreal, so implausible. Another one of the binaries Gray talks about being one of the contradictions of 9/11 is dream versus reality. The events are so nightmarish, they almost didn't happen. Yet they did, and yet Keith survived them. Is kind of the crazy thing to her there that she can't move past. Finally, the last kind of binary here that reflects innocence and experience in the story is the first plane versus the second plane. When they're watching the footage at the end, Keith says, the first plane seems like an accident, and the second plane, marks the transition to experience, is basically the last line of the story. The second plane is also the one that the narrator says enters Leanne's body and gets under her skin when she watches it. And so there's something shocking. It's kind of like seeing twins walk through a room, right? If you see a twin, you see someone walk through the room and you think something about their appearance. That person's attractive, that person's unattractive, they're tall, they're short, whatever. Then you see their twin walk through the room after them. Whatever initial thoughts you had about seeing that person, it's all driven home further. It's all reflected more, seeing that second person walk through. So seeing the second plane hit almost makes it real. If more real. If 9/11, one of the contradictions that appears from it is the events are almost too nightmarish to really be believed as real, the second plane makes it impossible for them not to be believed as real. Because you see it hit once, you think maybe it's an accident, maybe it's a dream, maybe it's a hoax. You see it hit twice, you know that can't be the case. And so DeLillo captures that feeling well here when Keith and Leanne are watching the footage at the end. Okay, so I just have a couple last things to say. That seems like kind of a downer note now to end the class on. But again, I think the issues DeLillo addresses that we just talked about can't really be ignored in considering the current state of literary studies and how literary studies is going to move forward. So after comparing either the Bible verses or Yeats to DeLillo's story and their depictions of 9/11 and their depictions of the end of the world, I'd like you to also debate the current state of literary studies in your post. What has this class taught you about literature? As someone who chose to take this class, you must have some level of interest in literature. What is your stake in it? Where do you see it going? I want to know these things. So please share them in your posts. And finally, I just want to thank you, since this is the last lesson for a great semester. Like I said, because of what came up with the lessons this time, I've had the opportunity to read some of your work before finishing this final lesson, and I've really enjoyed it. So thank you again for that, and I wish you luck in your endeavors, and hope you have success going forward.